Hello friends, let's today movie story of Rambo. First Blood is a 1982 American war action film starring Sylvester Stallone as Vietnam War veteran John Rambo. The film was directed by Ted Kotcheff and co-written by Michael Kozol, William Sackheim and Stallone based on the 1972 novel First Blood by David Morrell. It is the first installment in the Rambo film series, followed by Rambo, First Blood Part 2. The story follows Rambo, after entering a small town and clashing with the police, attempts to survive a manhunt using his expertise in survival and combat skills. The film co-stars Richard Crenna as Rambo's mentor Colonel Sam Trotman and Brian Dennehy as Sheriff Will Teasel. First Blood was released in the United States on October 22, 1982. Initial reviews were mixed, but the film was a box office success, grossing $160.3 million and becoming the 13th highest grossing film at the domestic box office for the year and the 7th highest grossing film worldwide, 7, in 1985. It also became the first Hollywood blockbuster to be released in China, holding the record for the largest number of tickets sold for an American film until 2018. Since its release, it has been reappraised by critics, with many highlighting the roles of Stallone, Dennehy and Crenna, and recognizing it as an influential film in the action genre. The film's success spawned the Rambo franchise, consisting of 4 sequels, co-written by and starring Stallone, an animated television series, a comic book series, a novel series and several video games. Plot. In December 1981, United States Army Vietnam War veteran John Rambo discovers that he is the last surviving member of his outfit after learning that his old army buddy has died from complications related to Agent Orange exposure from when they were deployed. Without direction, Rambo arrives in the town of Hope, Washington on foot, where he is accosted by local Sheriff Will Teasel, who judges him harshly and presumes him to be a drifter. Teasel escorts Rambo out of town and warns him not to return. Feeling slighted, Rambo begins to return to town, where Teasel quickly arrests him and leaves him to be processed under the supervision of Teasel's Kroll Chief Deputy Art Gult, who joins other deputies in abusing Rambo. The abuse triggers flashbacks to torture that Rambo endured in Vietnam, and he fights his way out of town with his field knife into the surrounding mountains. Teasel organizes a search party with his fellow deputies, air support, and dogs. Gult ignores Teasel's orders and attempts to shoot Rambo from a low-flying helicopter, but falls to his death when Rambo throws a rock that causes the pilot to lose control. Teasel soon learns that Rambo is a former Special Forces soldier and recipient of the Medal of Honor, but refuses to cancel the search. Not wanting to cause more trouble, Rambo attempts to surrender, but is fired upon by the deputies and flees into the tree line. Rambo uses bushcraft to create traps to subdue the pursuing officers, threatening Teasel at knife point to abandon his pursuit before fleeing further into the woods. Washington State Patrol officers and Washington National Guard forces are dispatched to assist with the search, along with Rambo's mentor and former commanding officer Colonel Samuel Trotman. Trotman advises Teasel to relent, but Teasel refuses. Over radio, Rambo refuses Trotman's pleas to surrender, condemning Teasel and his men and insisting that they drew first blood. Rambo falls back to an abandoned mine, where National Guard units fire an M72 law to collapse the mine after suppressive fire fails to force Rambo to surrender. Teasel and the others initially presume Rambo to be dead, but Rambo escapes the mine through a ventilation shaft and returns to town after hijacking a military transport truck, intent on confronting Teasel. Trotman again fails to convince Teasel to cancel the pursuit, while Rambo creates a distraction by causing a gas station explosion, cutting power to most of the town and destroying a gun store. After shooting indiscriminately in the sheriff's office, Rambo shoots Teasel in the leg, previously injuring him with an M60 machine gun that Rambo had taken from the military truck. Trotman arrives and appeals to Rambo, who finally relents and surrenders after relating his negative experiences from the war and from his return home. Trotman comforts Rambo before escorting him into federal custody. Teasel is taken to an ambulance for treatment of his injuries. Cast. Main article, list of Rambo characters. Sylvester Stallone as John J. Rambo. Richard Crenna as Colonel Samuel R. Sam Trotman. Brian Dennehy as Sheriff William Will Teasel. Doe McKinney as Captain Dave Curran. Jack Starrett as Deputy Sergeant Arthur Art Gult. Michael Talbot as Deputy Balford. Chris Mulkey as Deputy Ward. John McLeam as Orville Kellerman. Alf Humphreys as Deputy Lester. David Caruso as Deputy Mitch Rogers. David Crowley as Deputy Shingleton. Don McKay as Deputy Preston. Patrick Stack as Lieutenant Clinton Morgan. Production. Development. The original Rambo was so bloodthirsty, the story was so hard, so terrifying every step of the way. I think that's one reason the book took so long to get done. What I did with Rambo was try to keep one foot in the establishment and one foot in the outlaw or frontier image. I wanted him to be accepted by the mainstream, but also be a criminal. So he has some strong patriotic views, and he loves the system. He just doesn't like a lot of the people who live and work in it. Sylvester Stallone, 1985, 4. In 1972, Lawrence Terman at Columbia Pictures bought the film rights to First Blood for $175,000. Richard Brooks was slated to direct, and intended to have the film be an allegory on differing American perceptions of World War II and Vietnam War veterans, with Sheriff Teasle portrayed more sympathetically than in the novel. The film would have ended with Teasle ordering his men to drop their guns to try to reason with Rambo, who would have then been fatally shot by an unknown assailant. Brooks planned to start shooting First Blood in New Mexico in December 1972. The film did not proceed because the Vietnam War was still underway and Brooks left the project, citation needed. Afterward, John Kelly purchased the rights at Warner Brothers Pictures for $125,000 with the thought of casting either Robert De Niro or Clint Eastwood as Rambo. A screenplay was written by Walter Newman with Martin Ritt intended to direct. The film would have criticized American military culture and portrayed Colonel Troutman as the film's villain, ending with both Rambo and Teasle dying. 4. Sidney Pollack and Martin Bregman also considered directing the film, with Bregman hiring David Rabe to write a script. After Bregman departed, Mike Nichols considered directing Rabe's script. William Sackheim and Michael Kozol wrote the screenplay that would be the basis of the final film in 1977, originally intending for John Badham to direct. Producer Carter DeHaven purchased Sackheim and Kozol's script from Warner Brothers for $375,000. DeHaven secured the Cinema Group as a financier and hired John Frankenheimer as director, with production to begin in Georgia. This was also the first version of the script in which Rambo survived the film. However, the project stalled again after the distributor Filmways was acquired by Orion Pictures. 4. After Mario Kassar and Andrew D. Vajna of Anabasis Investments read the book, they became interested in doing an adaptation as the first production of their studio Carolco Pictures, funded by in-house sources. They purchased the film rights from Warner Brothers for $375,000 and Sackheim and Kozol's script for $125,000 in 1981. 9. Ted Kotcheff, who had been involved in the project in 1976, returned after Kassar and Vajna offered to finance one of his projects. 5. Kotcheff offered the role of John Rambo to Sylvester Stallone, and the actor accepted after reading the script through in a day. 10. Various scripts adapted from Morell's book had been pitched to studios in the years since its publication, but only Stallone's involvement prompted its production. The time since the end of the Vietnam War and Stallone's star power after the success of the Rocky films enabled him to rewrite the script to make the character of John Rambo more sympathetic. Morell's book has Rambo kill many of his pursuers, and Kozol and Sackheim's draft had him killing 16 people, but in the movie Rambo does not directly cause the death of any police or National Guardsmen. Stallone also decided to let Rambo survive the film, unlike in the book. A suicide scene was filmed but was reviled by test audiences. 5. So Kotcheff and Stallone opted to have Rambo turn himself in at Troutman's urging. 10. Other changes made by Stallone included the addition of Rambo's survival knife. 5. Stallone did an estimated 7 revisions of the script. Kotcheff requested further work be done on the script, which was performed by Larry Gross and David Giler. 4. Casting. Brooks originally wanted to cast Bette Davis as a psychiatrist and either Burt Lancaster or Lee Marvin as Sheriff Teasle. When the project was purchased by Warner Brothers, Robert De Niro and Clint Eastwood were each considered for the role of Rambo. 11. Ritt intended to cast Paul Newman as Rambo. 5. Pollock considered Steve McQueen but then rejected him because they considered him too old to play a Vietnam veteran from 1975. 5. 12. James Caan, Burt Reynolds, and Robert Redford were also considered. 13. Rabe developed his screenplay with Al Pacino in mind for the role and had several conversations with the actor, who wanted to portray Rambo as a force of nature after seeing the film Jaws. However, Pacino decided not to be involved because he found the story too dark, after his request that Rambo be a lunatic was dismissed by the producers. 11, 14, 15. When Batten was considered as director, he wanted to cast John Travolta as Rambo, George C. Scott as Trotman, and either Gene Hackman or Charles Durning as Teasel. Frankenheimer considered Powers Booth, Michael Douglas, and Nick Nolte as Rambo before casting Brad Davis because of his role in Midnight Express. 4. Dustin Hoffman was offered the role of Rambo but turned it down. 16. For the role of Sheriff Teasel, Kasser and Vajna approached Academy Award winners Hackman and Robert Duvall but both turned the part down. Marvin, another Oscar winner, turned down the part of Colonel Trotman. James Mason and Richard Yeckel were also considered. Kirk Douglas was eventually hired. Douglas wrote in his autobiography that he initially rejected the script but agreed after Kochev changed it to retain the novel's original ending. When the ending was changed back to Stallone's version, he left the project. 17. He wrote, "I thought it would be better, dramatically, if my character realized what a Frankenstein monster, a moral killer, and menace to society he has created and kills Stallone. If they'd listened to me, there would have been no Rambos. They would have lost $1 billion. 18. Rock Hudson was approached as a replacement but was soon to undergo heart surgery and had to pass up the chance to work with Stallone. Richard Crenna was hired as a replacement. The role of Trotman became the veteran character actor's most famous role, a performance for which he received much critical praise. 10. Filming. The Bridge in Hope, BC, used during production. The film was shot in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia on a $15 million budget beginning on November 15, 1981, and continuing until April 1982. 10. 8. The town scenes in the movie were shot in Hope and the nearby Coquihalla Canyon Provincial Park, called Chapman Gorge in the film. 19. While the rest of the movie was shot in Capilano Canyon, Golden Ears Provincial Park, and Tidd Lake in Pitt Meadows. During the production, Buzz Feitshans replaced producer Ed Carlin, who suffered a heart attack. 4. 8. The locations chosen for the film initially experienced unseasonably warm and sunny weather during the filming, which posed challenges since the crew had counted on an overcast setting. However, a period of heavy snowfall beginning in January 1982 delayed the production by 2 months. Other delays were caused by injuries to the cast during stunts, including Stallone sustaining a serious back injury and several broken ribs, in particular, due to performing his own stunt of dropping off a cliff and into a tree. 20. 21. 8. Since the production ran over schedule, Crenna's role in the film was cut in order to avoid having to pay him higher fees as specified in his contract. 17. The firearms used in the film had to be imported into Canada because of the country's firearms regulation. 22. 23. In January 1982, over $50,000 worth of firearms, including 14 M16 rifles, 3 Remington shotguns, 2.44 Magnum revolvers, and 11 Colt AR-15 rifles, were stolen from the set. Although the guns had been modified to shoot blanks, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police claimed that they could be easily modified to fire live ammunition. After the incident, the set was guarded by the Canadian Army, whose soldiers also served as extras in the film. 17. 8. Post-production. The first rough cut of the film was between 3 and 3.5 hours long. According to Sylvester Stallone, it was so bad that it sickened him and his agent. Stallone wanted to buy the movie and destroy it, thinking that it was a career killer. After heavy re-editing, the film was cut down to 93 minutes. This version was ultimately released in theaters. 24. The ending used in the finished film was shot in March 1982, after the original one was deemed unsatisfactory. 25. Kasser and Vajna sought either Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox or Paramount Pictures as a distributor, displaying an 18-minute promotional reel to studios. Although they secured international distributors, they were unable to locate a domestic distributor to the film until they sent a longer 55-minute reel to the American film market. After Warner Brothers and Paramount expressed interest, Orion Pictures agreed to the domestic distribution of the film. 8. Music. Main article, First Blood, soundtrack. The film's score was composed and conducted by Jerry Goldsmith, whose theme It's a Long Road added a new dimension to the character, and featured in the film's 3 sequels and animated spin-off. The soundtrack was originally released on LP by the Regency label, although it was edited out of sequence for a more satisfying listen. The album was reissued on CD with 1 extra track, No Power, twice, first as one of Entrada Records' initial titles, then as an identical release by Varese Sarabande. The complete score was released by Entrada in a 2 CD set, along with a remastered version of the original album, with the Carol Colobo, previously released on La La Land Records' Extreme Prejudice album, and the Rambo, First Blood Part 2 trailer music added, on November 23, 2010, as one of their MAF Unlimited titles. Release. Home Media. David Morrell recorded an audio commentary track for the First Blood Special Edition DVD released in 2002. Sylvester Stallone recorded an audio commentary track for the First Blood Ultimate Edition DVD released in 2004. This edition also includes the original ending in which Rambo commits suicide, and a humorous ending tacked on afterwards. A brief snippet of the suicide ending appears in a flashback in the fourth movie. Lionsgate also released this version on Blu-ray. Both commentary tracks are on the Blu-ray release. Momentum Pictures released an HD DVD version of First Blood in the United Kingdom in April 2007. Lionsgate also released First Blood as a double feature on February 13, 2007, along with 2004's The Punisher, 26. First Blood was released on 4K UHD Blu-ray on November 9, 2018, 27. Reception. Box office. First Blood topped the US box office for 3 weeks in a row, 28, and its $6,642,005 opening weekend was the best October opening at the time, 10. The film ended as a significant financial success, with a total gross of $64 million domestically, the highest grossing film of the fall, 29, and the 13th highest grossing film of the year, 30. The film grossed $160.3 million worldwide, against a $15 million budget. 6. It was the first major Hollywood blockbuster to be released in China, where it was released in 1985. 31. It sold 76 million tickets in China, the highest for a foreign Hollywood film up until 2018. Critical response. The film received mixed reviews from critics, and three lead actors received praise for their performances. In his review, Roger Ebert wrote that he did not like the film's ending, but added it was a very good movie, well-paced, and well-acted not only by Stallone, but also by Crenna and Brian Dennehy. He commented, although almost all of First Blood is implausible, because it's Stallone on the screen, we'll buy it, and rated the film 3 out of 4 stars, 32. The New York Times film critic Janet Maslin described Rambo as a fierce, agile, hollow-eyed hero who was portrayed as a tormented, misunderstood, amazingly resourceful victim of the Vietnam War, rather than as a sadist or a villain. Maslin also praised the film's story for its energy and ingenuity. 33. Conversely, Variety called the film a mess and criticized its ending for not providing a proper resolution for the main character. 34. Film writer Jack Hawkins took a different view on the ending, praising the scene for containing the finest acting of Stallone's career, adding, "There are no one-liners, no showy acts of bravado, just messy emotion without any catharsis. Stallone couldn't have played the scene better and neither could anyone else." 35. First Blood has been considered as belonging to the vetsploitation subgenre. 36, 37, 38, 39. In 2000, BBC film critic Almar Haflidason noted that Stallone's training and survival skills in hand-to-hand combat gave the film a raw and authentic edge that excited the audiences of the time. 40. Film.com and Filmsite regard First Blood as one of the best films of 1982, 41, 42. And in 2008 it was named the 253rd greatest film ever by Empire magazine on its 2008 list of the 500 greatest movies of all time. 43. In 2015, Rolling Stone ranked the movie at number 7 on a 10 best action movies of all time. 44. On review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an 86% approval rating based on 49 reviews, with an average rating of July 20, 10. The site's critics' consensus reads, much darker and more sensitive than the sequels it spawned, First Blood is a thrilling survival adventure that takes full advantage of Sylvester Stallone's acting skills. 45. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 61 out of 100 based on 15 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. 46. James Berardinelli of ReelViews called the film a tense and effective piece of filmmaking. He noted that the film's darker tone, somber subtext, and non-exploitative violence allowed the viewer to enjoy the film not only as an action/thriller but as something with a degree of intelligence and substance. On Stallone's performance, he wrote, "It seems impossible to imagine anyone other than Stallone in the part, and his capabilities as an actor should not be dismissed." 47. In the 2010 edition of his movie guide, Leonard Melton gave the film 1.5 stars out of 4, saying that it throws all credibility to the winds about the time. Rambo gets off with only a bad cut after jumping from a mountain into some jagged rocks. 48. Legacy. First Blood received the most positive reception of the Rambo franchise. The 4 sequels received mixed or average reviews, 49, 50, 51. In a 2011 article for Blade magazine, by Mike Carter, credit is given to Morrell and the Rambo franchise for revitalizing the cutlery industry in the 1980s due to the presence of the Jimmy Lyle and Dill Hibben knives used in the films. In 2003, Blade magazine gave Morrell an Industry Achievement Award for having helped to make it possible. 52. Morrell said his being given the award is ironic, because the knife was Sylvester Stallone's idea and does not appear in the novel. 5. Rambo's survival knife became an iconic movie weapon. In a July 28, 2013 auction, the original knife and its sheath were sold for $92,250. And even a set of 100 replicas of the knife produced by Lyle in 1982 have been valued at $45,000 each. 5. A writer from the American think tank Foundation for Economic Education commented that the sequence of events in the film are the result of police brutality. He goes on to say that Teasel's initial approach with Rambo was without reason, and that he could have driven him to the diner or simply left him alone. He assigned blame to Teasel's actions and compared the situation to a number of 21st-century police encounters that turned deadly. War film is a film genre concerned with warfare, typically about naval, air, or land battles, with combat scenes central to the drama. It has been strongly associated with the 20th century. 1. 2. The faithful nature of battle scenes means that war films often end with them. Themes explored include combat, survival and escape, camaraderie between soldiers, sacrifice, the futility and inhumanity of battle, the effects of war on society, and the moral and human issues raised by war. War films are often categorized by their milieu, such as the Korean War. The most popular subjects are the Second World War and the American Civil War. The stories told may be fiction, historical drama, or biographical. Critics have noted similarities between the Western and the war film. Nations such as China, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia have their own traditions of war film, centered on their own revolutionary wars but taking varied forms, from action and historical drama to wartime romance. Subgenres, not necessarily distinct, include anti-war, comedy, propaganda, and documentary. There are similarly subgenres of the war film in specific theaters such as the Western Desert of North Africa and the Pacific in the Second World War, Vietnam, or the Soviet-Afghan War, and films set in specific domains of war, such as the infantry, the air, at sea, in submarines, or at prisoner of war camps. Genre. Further information, list of war films. The war film genre is not necessarily tightly defined. The American Film Institute, for example, speaks of films to grapple with the Great War without attempting to classify these. 3. However, some directors and critics have offered at least tentative definitions. The director Sam Fuller defined the genre by saying that a war film's objective, no matter how personal or emotional, is to make a viewer feel war. 4. John Belton identified 4 narrative elements of the war film within the context of Hollywood production. A. The suspension of civilian morality during times of war. B. Primacy of collective goals over individual motivations. C. Rivalry between men and predominantly male groups as well as marginalization and objectification of women. And D. Depiction of the reintegration of veterans. 5. The faithful nature of battle scenes means that war films often end with them. 6. John Wayne and the Longest Day, 1962. The film critic Stephen Neal suggests that the genre is for the most part well-defined and uncontentious, since war films are simply those about war being waged in the 20th century, with combat scenes central to the drama. However, Neal notes, films set in the American Civil War or the American Indian Wars of the 19th century were called war films in the time before the First World War. 1. The critic Julian Smith argues, on the contrary, that the war film lacks the formal boundaries of a genre like the Western, but that in practice, successful and influential war films are about modern wars, in particular World War II, with the combination of mobile forces and mass killing. 2. The film scholar Catherine Kane, 7. points out some similarities between the war film genre and the Western. Both genres use opposing concepts like war and peace, civilization, and savagery. War films usually frame World War II as a conflict between good and evil as represented by the Allied forces in Nazi Germany, whereas the Western portrays the conflict between civilized settlers and the savage indigenous peoples. 8. James Clark notes the similarity between a Western like Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch and war movie escapades like The Dirty Dozen. 9. The film historian Janine Basinger states that she began with a preconception of what the war film genre would be, namely that What I knew in advance was what presumably every member of our culture would know about World War II combat films, that they contained a hero, a group of mixed types of people, and a military objective of some sort. They take place in the actual combat zones of World War II, against the established enemies, on the ground, the sea, or in the air. They contain many repeated events, such as mail call, all presented visually with appropriate uniforms, equipment, and iconography of battle. 10. Further, Basinger considers Batan to provide a definition by example of the World War II combat film, in which a diverse and apparently unsuited group of hastily assembled volunteers hold off a much larger group of the enemy through their bravery and tenacity. But 11. She argues that the combat film is not a subgenre but the only genuine kind of war film. Since she notes that there were in fact only 5 true combat films made during the Second World War, in her view these few films, central to the genre, are outweighed by the many other films that are only just war films. 12. However, other critics such as Russell Earl Shane propose a far broader definition of war film, to include films that deal with the roles of civilians, espionage agents, and soldiers in any of the aspects of war, i.e. preparation, cause, prevention, conduct, daily life, and consequences, or aftermath. 13. Neil points out that genres overlap, with combat scenes for different purposes in other types of film, and suggests that war films are characterized by combat which determines the fate of the principal characters. This in turn pushes combat scenes to the climactic ends of war films. 6. Not all critics agree, either, that war films must be about 20th century wars. James Clark includes Edward Zwick's Oscar-winning Glory, 1990, among the war films he discusses in detail. It is set in the American Civil War, and he lists 6 other films about that war which he considers notable. 14. The screenwriter and scholar Eric R. Williams identifies war films as one of 11 supergenres in his screenwriter's taxonomy, claiming that all feature-length narrative films can be classified as belonging to one of them. 16. The British military historian Anthony Beevor despairs at how filmmakers from America and Britain play fast and loose with the facts, yet imply that their version is as good as the truth. 17. For example, he calls the 2000 American film U-571 a shameless deception for pretending that a U.S. warship had helped to win the Battle of the Atlantic 7 months before America entered the war. 17. He is equally critical of Christopher Nolan's 2017 film Dunkirk with its unhistorically empty beaches, low-level air combat over the sea, and rescues mainly by the little ships. 17. Beevor feels, however, that continental European filmmakers are often far more scrupulous. For example, in his view the 2004 German film Downfall accurately depicted the historical events of Hitler's final days in his Berlin bunker. 17. And he considers the 1965 French film The 317th Platoon, set in Vietnam, the greatest war movie ever made. The 1966 film The Battle of Algiers is, he argues, a close second. 17. History. American Civil War. Further information, list of films and television shows about the American Civil War. The costliest war in U.S. history in terms of American life, this war has been the subject of, or the backdrop to, numerous films, documentaries and miniseries. One of the earliest films using the Civil War as its subject was D.W. Griffith's 1910 silent picture, The Fugitive. 18.